Daniel Reed's worn boots crunched through the frozen leaves as he stared at the rusted steel door embedded in the mountainside, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter November air. The locals in Pine Ridge had been right about one thing. This Cold War bunker looked like nothing more than a concrete tomb sealed away in the Colorado wilderness. What they didn't know was that behind that corroded entrance lay $160 million worth of stolen masterpieces, hidden away since the 1960s, and Daniel's life was about to change forever. But he didn't know that yet. He was just a struggling single father wondering how he'd gotten stuck with this inheritance that everyone said was worthless. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Daniel's calloused hands trembled as he fumbled with the heavy brass key that had arrived in the mail 3 weeks earlier, along with a letter from his old Army buddy Marcus Chen's attorney. Marcus had died in a car accident outside Denver, leaving behind nothing but debts and this mysterious bunker that he'd somehow acquired years ago through a government surplus auction. The two men had served together in Afghanistan, bonding over late-night conversations about their dreams of building better lives for their families when they got home. Now, Marcus was gone, and Daniel was left holding the key to what everyone in Pine Ridge called Chen's folly. The heavy door groaned open with a metallic shriek that echoed through the pine trees, revealing a narrow concrete corridor that disappeared into absolute darkness. Daniel clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through air that tasted of rust and decades of abandonment. His work boots echoed against the concrete floor as he stepped inside, trying to ignore the claustrophobic feeling of being surrounded by walls thick enough to withstand a nuclear blast. The bunker had been built during the height of the Cold War, one of hundreds scattered across the American West, designed to house government officials and military personnel in case the unthinkable happened. Daniel's financial situation had been spiraling downward for months now, ever since the construction company he worked for had folded, taking his steady paycheck with it. His 12-year-old daughter, Sarah, needed new winter clothes. The rent on their small apartment in Pine Ridge was 3 weeks overdue, and his pickup truck was making ominous grinding noises that probably meant expensive cough. Repairs he couldn't afford. The inheritance of this bunker had felt like a cruel joke when the lawyer first contacted him, another burden rather than a blessing, but Daniel had hoped against hope that maybe Marcus had left him something of value. The main corridor branched into several smaller rooms, each one filled with rusted military equipment and moldy furniture that had been abandoned when the bunker was decommissioned in the early 1990s. Daniel's flashlight beam swept across overturned desks, broken chairs, and filing cabinets with their drawers hanging open like slack jaws. Water had seeped through cracks in the concrete over the years, creating dark stains on the walls and filling the air with the smell of decay and neglect. This was exactly what the townspeople had warned him about. A concrete shell, filled with nothing but spiders and regret. He spent the better part of the morning exploring the accessible areas of the bunker, his initial optimism fading with each empty room he discovered. The place had been stripped of anything valuable long before Marcus had acquired it, leaving behind only the bones of what had once been a vital piece of America's defense infrastructure. Daniel was about to give up and head back to town when his flashlight beam caught something unusual. A section of wall in the deepest part of the bunker that looked different from the rest. The concrete here was smoother, newer somehow, as if it had been poured years after the original construction. Daniel ran his hands along the surface, feeling for any irregularities, and his fingers found what felt like a seam running vertically from floor to ceiling. He pressed against the wall and felt it give slightly, revealing that what he had taken for solid concrete was actually a cleverly disguised door. His heart rate quickened as he searched for a way to open it, finally discovering a hidden lever concealed behind a loose section of concrete molding. The hidden door swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a room that had been sealed away from the rest of the bunker for decades. Daniel's flashlight beam swept across walls lined with wooden crates, each one carefully labeled with numbers and Cyrillic letters that meant nothing to him. The air in this secret chamber was different, dry and still, preserved by some kind of climate control system that was still humming quietly in the background. Whatever was in those crates, someone had gone to great lengths to keep it safe and hidden. Daniel approached the nearest crate with trembling hands, his mind racing with possibilities. The wood was old but well preserved, held together with metal bands that had been painted with some kind of protective coating. A crowbar hung from a hook on the wall, as if left there specifically for this moment, and Daniel used it to pry open the first crate with careful, deliberate movements. The lid came away with a soft crack, revealing layers of protective cloth wrapped around something rectangular and heavy. His breath caught in his throat as he carefully peeled away the wrapping to reveal an oil painting of breathtaking beauty, a landscape that seemed to glow with inner light even in the harsh glare of his flashlight. The signature in the corner was one he recognized from art books he'd browsed in the library, though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. This looked like the work of a master, something that belonged in a museum, rather than hidden away in a Cold War bunker in the Colorado mountains. Daniel's hands shook as he moved to the next crate, then the next, each one revealing treasures that seemed too valuable to be real. Paintings by artists whose names he'd heard whispered in reverent tones, sculptures carved from marble so fine it seemed to glow, religious artifacts encrusted with precious stones that caught the light and threw it back in. Brilliant rainbows. The secret room contained what appeared to be dozens of masterpieces, each one carefully preserved and protected from the ravages of time and weather. As he explored deeper into the collection, Daniel began to notice patterns in the pieces that made his stomach twist with unease. Many of the paintings bore small brass plaques, with text in multiple languages, suggesting they had once been displayed in museums or private collections. Some of the sculptures showed signs of hasty removal, with mounting hardware still attached to their bases. This wasn't just a hidden art collection, this was a repository of stolen treasures, and Daniel was beginning to understand the true nature of what Marcus had inherited and passed on to him. The implications hit him like a physical blow as he continued his exploration of the secret chamber. These weren't just valuable artworks, they were pieces that had been looted during World War II and the chaotic years that followed, stolen from museums, churches, and private collections across Eastern Europe and spirited away to America during the height of the Cold War. The Cyrillic letters on the crates, the professional preservation methods, the climate control system that had kept everything in perfect condition, it all pointed to a sophisticated operation that had been hiding these treasures for decades. Daniel sank down onto one of the unopened crates, his mind reeling from the magnitude of his discovery. He was holding his phone, trying to get a signal in the depths of the bunker, when he realized the full weight of his situation. He was now in possession of what could be hundreds of millions of dollars worth of stolen art, pieces that rightfully belonged to museums and families who had lost everything during the darkest period of the 20th century. But he was also a single father facing eviction, with a daughter who needed him to provide for her, and the temptation to simply take what he'd found and disappear was almost overwhelming. The next several hours passed in a blur as Daniel documented everything he could with his phone's camera, taking pictures of the paintings, sculptures, and identifying marks that might help determine their origins and value. He found himself torn between the immediate practical needs of his family and the moral implications of profiting from stolen art. Some of these pieces had probably been ripped from the walls of Jewish homes during the Holocaust, or taken from bombed museums in cities that no longer existed, and keeping them felt like participating in that crate. Original theft. But as he thought about Sarah's worn-out shoes and the overdue rent notices piling up on his kitchen table, Daniel found himself considering options he would have dismissed as unthinkable just hours earlier. Maybe he could sell just one piece, something small that wouldn't be missed, just enough to get caught up on his bills and buy some time to figure out what to do with the rest. Maybe whoever had hidden these treasures here was dead anyway, and the rightful owners would never be found, making his discovery a victimless windfall that could transform his family's future. Daniel spent the rest of that day photographing and cataloging everything he could access, his excitement growing as he began to understand the true scope of the collection. There were paintings by artists he'd only heard about in documentaries, sculptures that belonged in the world's greatest museums, and religious artifacts that had probably been sacred to communities that no longer existed. The estimated value of what he'd found was staggering, more money than he could have earned in several lifetimes of construction work. As afternoon faded into evening, Daniel finally forced himself to leave the bunker and drive back to Pine Ridge, his mind churning with possibilities and moral conflicts. He picked up Sarah from her after-school program, trying to act normal while his thoughts raced between dreams of financial security and nightmares about the legal consequences of possessing stolen property. Sarah chattered about her day, complaining about the holes in her winter coat and asking when they might be able to afford the class trip to Denver that all her friends were going on. That night, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling of their small apartment, listening to the neighbors arguing through the thin walls and trying to process what he'd discovered. He thought about Marcus and wondered if his old friend had known what he was passing along, or if the bunker's secret had died with its previous owner. He thought about the families who had originally owned these masterpieces, and whether any of them were still alive to reclaim their heritage. Most of all, he thought about Sarah and the opportunities that $160 million could provide for her education and future. The next morning brought a new problem that put Daniel's discovery into sharp perspective. Sarah woke up with a fever and a cough that sounded like it was coming from deep in her chest, the kind of illness that would require a doctor's visit they couldn't afford. Daniel called in sick to the part-time job he'd managed to find at the hardware store, spending the day caring for his daughter and researching art recovery organizations on the library's public computers during Sarah's naps. What he found online made his situation even more complicated. There were entire organizations dedicated to returning stolen artwork to its rightful owners or their descendants, and many of the pieces he'd photographed appeared on various databases of looted art. The process of repatriation could take years and involve international law enforcement, courts, and governments, but it was clearly the right thing to do. The problem was that doing the right thing wouldn't pay for Sarah's medical care or keep them from being evicted from their apartment. Daniel found himself caught in an impossible situation, possessing treasures of immense value while facing immediate financial crisis. He researched the legal implications of his discovery, learning that good faith finders of stolen property were sometimes entitled to rewards or compensation, but the process was complex and could take years to resolve. Meanwhile, Sarah's cough was getting worse, and the overdue notices from their landlord were becoming increasingly threatening. After 3 sleepless nights, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He contacted Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a professor of art history at the University of Colorado, who specialized in recovering looted artwork, and asked to meet with her about a sensitive matter. Dr. Morrison agreed to drive up to Pine Ridge the following weekend, intrigued by Daniel's vague description of a significant discovery that might be relevant to her work. The meeting took place at the local diner on a snowy Saturday morning, with Sarah safely at her friend's house for a sleepover. Daniel had brought printed copies of some of his photographs, carefully chosen to demonstrate the significance of his find without revealing its full scope. Dr. Morrison's reaction was everything he had hoped for and feared, her eyes widening with recognition and excitement as she studied the images of paintings she had only seen in black and white photographs in academic wall papers about wartime art theft. Dr. Morrison explained that several of the pieces Daniel had photographed were on international watch lists, reported stolen from various locations across Eastern Europe between 1940 and 1960. The quality of preservation was remarkable, she noted, suggesting that whoever had hidden them away had both the resources and expertise to maintain them properly. She estimated that the total value of just the pieces Daniel had shown her could exceed $50 million, and she suspected there was much more that he hadn't yet revealed. The professor offered to help Daniel navigate the complex legal and ethical issues surrounding his discovery, emphasizing that while the process of repatriation might be long and complicated, there were often substantial finder's fees and rewards available for people who came forward with stolen art. She also mentioned that there were emergency funds available from various foundations to help people in Daniel's situation while the legal process played out, ensuring that doing the right thing wouldn't mean financial ruin for his family. Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders as Dr. Morrison outlined a path forward that could address both his immediate financial needs and the moral obligations that had been keeping him awake at night. They agreed to return to the bunker together the following week, with Dr. Morrison bringing a team of experts to properly document and assess the full scope of the collection. She also put Daniel in touch with a lawyer who specialized in art recovery cases, someone who could protect his interests while ensuring that the rightful owners of these treasures were identified and contacted. The news of Daniel's discovery leaked to the media within days of Dr. Morrison's initial assessment, despite their attempts to keep the investigation quiet while the legal framework was established. A reporter from the Denver Post somehow learned about the bunker and the art collection, publishing a story that made national headlines within hours. Suddenly, Daniel found himself at the center of an international media storm, with news crews camping outside his apartment and reporters calling his phone at all hours of the day and night. The attention was overwhelming and mostly unwelcome, turning Daniel and Sarah's quiet life in Pine Ridge into a circus of journalists, art experts, and curiosity seekers who descended on the small mountain town Burr. Like a swarm of locusts, the local sheriff had to set up barriers around the bunker site to keep treasure hunters and sightseers from breaking in, while Daniel struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Sarah's sake. The 12-year-old girl was fascinated by the sudden fame, but also frightened by the strangers who seemed to know details about their lives that hadn't been reported in the news. Within a week, delegations from several European countries had contacted Daniel through Dr. Morrison and his lawyer, each claiming that some of the artworks belonged to their national collections. A group of Holocaust survivors and their descendants filed legal claims for pieces they believed had been stolen from their families during the war, armed with old photographs and documentation that had survived decades in hiding. The story became a symbol of the ongoing effort to return looted art to its rightful owners, but it also highlighted the complex legal and moral questions surrounding cultural property that had been displaced by war and conflict. Daniel's financial situation began to improve almost immediately, even before any formal legal resolution was reached. A major news network paid him a substantial sum for exclusive access to the bunker and his story, providing enough money to catch up on rent and bills while the longer-term legal process played out. Several art recovery organizations also provided emergency funding to ensure that Daniel and Sarah's basic needs were met, while the ownership questions were resolved. Recognizing that his cooperation in coming forward deserved support rather than punishment, the investigation into the bunker's contents revealed layers of history that went back decades, involving a complex network of dealers, collectors, and intermediaries who had moved stolen art through underground channels since the end of World War II. The bunker itself had been purchased at a government surplus auction by a man named Viktor Petrov, a Russian immigrant who had died in 1987 without revealing the location of his hidden collection. Petrov had somehow acquired the artworks during the chaotic post-war period and spent years moving them to increasingly secure hiding places as international efforts to recover stolen art intensified. Marcus Chen had unknowingly inherited Petrov's secret when he bought the bunker at another surplus auction, apparently unaware of what lay hidden behind the false wall in its depths. Daniel's lawyer discovered that Marcus had been researching the bunker's history in the months before his death, possibly trying to understand what he had acquired, but he had died before making any discoveries or decisions about the collection's future. The legal process of sorting out ownership claims and determining appropriate compensation took nearly 2 years, during which Daniel became something of a reluctant celebrity in the art world. He spoke at conferences about the importance of returning stolen cultural property, appeared in documentaries about art recovery, and worked closely with researchers who were using his discovery to trace other missing pieces from the same network of wartime looters. Sarah, now 14, had grown accustomed to their changed circumstances, using the stability and opportunities that their new situation provided to excel in school and pursue her interest in art history inspired Das by their unusual experience. The final resolution of the case established Daniel as one of the most significant contributors to art repatriation efforts in recent history. Of the 187 pieces found in the bunker, 131 were successfully returned to their rightful owners or heir families, while the remainder were donated to museums with clear provenance requirements. Daniel received finder's fees and rewards totaling just over $8 million, along with a substantial payment from a major museum that acquired several pieces through proper legal channels. The money was enough to transform Daniel and Sarah's lives completely, but perhaps more importantly, the experience had given them both a sense of purpose and connection to history that went far beyond their personal circumstances. Daniel used part of his compensation to establish a foundation dedicated to helping other people who discovered stolen art navigate the complex process of repatriation, while Sarah announced her intention to study art history and continue the work of returning displaced cultural treasures to their rightful homes. The bunker itself became something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in art recovery and World War II history, though Daniel kept its exact location secret to prevent vandalism and unauthorized prey. Treasure hunting. He partnered with the local historical society to create an educational exhibit about wartime art theft and recovery efforts, bringing visitors and revenue to Pine Ridge, while honoring the memory of the families who had lost these precious pieces during humanity's darkest hours. 3 years after first opening that rusted steel door, Daniel stood once again at the entrance to the bunker, this time accompanied by Sarah and a small group of Holocaust survivors who had come to see where their family's stolen treasures had been hidden for so many decades. The underground chambers were now empty, except for the climate control equipment that had preserved the collection so well, but the space had taken on a different kind of significance as a symbol of both loss and recovery, theft and justice. An elderly woman named Ruth Goldberg touched the wall where her father's paintings had been stored, tears streaming down her face as she thanked Daniel for choosing to do the right thing rather than the profitable thing. Her father had been a successful art dealer in Vienna before the war, and the 3 paintings that had been returned to her family were the only physical connection she had left to that lost world. The finder's fee Daniel had received for locating her father's work was substantial, but seeing Ruth's joy at being reunited with her heritage made him understand that some rewards couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Sarah, now 17, and bound for art school on a full scholarship, funded by one of the grateful museums that had benefited from Daniel's discovery, often reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that cold November morning when her father first opened the bunker door. The financial security was wonderful, of course, but what meant more to her was the knowledge that their family had played a part in healing some of the wounds left by historical injustice. She had met the descendants of original owners, heard their stories of loss and survival, and understood that art was never just about aesthetic beauty, but also about memory, identity, and the human need to preserve what matters most. Daniel's story became a case study taught in law schools and art history programs, an example of how individual choices could have far-reaching consequences for justice and historical healing. The Pine Ridge discovery, as it came to be known in academic circles, helped law enforcement agencies identify and recover dozens of additional stolen pieces that had been moved through the same network, ultimately leading to the repatriation of artwork worth over $400 million to families and museums around the world. The foundation Daniel established continued to grow and evolve, helping hundreds of people navigate the complex world of art recovery, while advocating for stronger laws to prevent the trafficking of stolen cultural property. Sarah joined the foundation's board while still in college, bringing fresh perspectives and energy to its mission of connecting displaced artworks with their rightful owners. Together, father and daughter had found a calling that grew out of their accidental encounter with hidden history, turning a moment of potential moral crisis into a lifetime commitment to justice and restoration. Looking back on that first day in the bunker, Daniel often marveled at how different his life might have been if he had chosen the easier path of simply selling what he found and keeping quiet about its origins. The money would have solved his immediate problems, certainly, but it would also have perpetuated the original theft and denied dozens of families the chance to reclaim their stolen heritage. Instead, his decision to seek help and do the right thing had not only provided financial security for his family, but had also given them both a sense of purpose and connection to something larger than themselves. The bunker still stood in the Colorado mountains, its steel door now bearing a bronze plaque commemorating the victims of wartime art theft and celebrating the power of individual conscience to correct historical injustices. Pine Ridge had grown and prospered as a result of the attention Daniel's discovery had brought to the area, with several museums and cultural institutions establishing satellite locations in the town to take advantage of its connection to one of the most significant art recovery stories of the 21st century. Daniel's transformation from struggling handyman to reluctant art world celebrity had been swift and dramatic, But the most important changes in his life were the ones that couldn't be measured in monetary terms. He had learned that inheritance could be more than just material possessions, that sometimes what we receive from the past carries obligations as well as opportunities. Marcus Chen's final gift had been more than just a bunker full of hidden treasure. It had been a chance for Daniel to make a choice that would echo through history and affect the lives of people he would never meet. Sarah's graduation from college was attended by several of the families who had benefited from the Pine Ridge discovery, turning what should have been a personal milestone into a celebration of the ongoing work of Dahlan. Historical justice. Dr. Morrison, now a close family friend and frequent collaborator, spoke at the ceremony about how individual acts of courage and conscience could ripple outward through time, affecting not just immediate circumstances, but the broader human story of loss, survival, and recovery. The network of relationships that had grown out of Daniel's discovery continued to expand and deepen over the years, connecting art historians, law enforcement officials, museum curators, and family members across continents in a shared commitment to returning stolen cultural property to its rightful place. Daniel found himself at the center of this informal international community, valued not just for his role in uncovering the hidden collection, but for his ongoing advocacy and his foundation's practical work in supporting other people facing similar situations. 20 years after that first cold morning in the bunker, Daniel Reed had become one of the most respected figures in the art recovery field. But he never lost sight of the fact that his entire career had started with a simple moral choice made by a desperate single father who could have used the money but chose to do the right thing instead. The Pine Ridge discovery had proven that ordinary people could still make extraordinary differences in the world, that individual conscience still mattered in an age of institutional complexity and moral ambiguity. The story of the Cold War bunker and its hidden treasures became part of American folklore, a reminder that valuable things sometimes came disguised as worthless inheritances, and that the most important discoveries were often the ones that revealed not just hidden wealth, but hidden responsibilities. Daniel's choice to transform his accidental windfall into a tool for justice had created a legacy that would outlast any individual fortune, proving that some inheritances were meant to be shared rather than hoarded, and that true wealth lay not in what we could take for ourselves, but in what we could give back to the world. The years that followed brought new challenges and revelations that continued to reshape Daniel's understanding of what he had discovered and what it meant for the future. Intelligence agencies from several countries began reaching out to his foundation, sharing classified information about other potential caches of stolen art that might be hidden in similar Cold War-era facilities. Across the American West, the Central Intelligence Agency declassified documents from the 1950s and 60s that revealed a systematic program of moving looted European art through a network of underground bunkers and safe-for-an houses, suggesting that Daniel's discovery was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Agent Catherine Wells from the FBI's art crime team became a regular visitor to Pine Ridge, working closely with Daniel and Sarah to develop new techniques for locating and investigating suspected art crests. Storage sites. The Bureau had been tracking rumors of hidden collections for decades, but the Pine Ridge discovery had provided the first concrete evidence that these stories were more than just Cold War legends. Agent Wells explained that the government had built hundreds of bunkers during the nuclear paranoia of the early Cold War, and many had been sold to private buyers when they were decommissioned, creating countless opportunities for people like Viktor Petrov to hide their ill-gotten gains. Sarah's work with the foundation had evolved beyond simple art recovery into a sophisticated operation that combined historical research, legal advocacy, and cutting-edge technology to track down missing BF cultural artifacts. She had developed relationships with researchers at major universities, creating a network of graduate students and professors who helped identify stolen pieces and trace their movements through the shadowy world of wartime art trafficking. Her senior thesis at Columbia University had focused on the psychological profiles of art looters and collectors, providing insights that law enforcement agencies now used in their investigations. The foundation's success had attracted attention from some unexpected quarters, including several billionaire collectors who had unknowingly purchased stolen pieces over the years and wanted to make things right without a burr. facing criminal prosecution. These collectors provided substantial funding for the Foundation's work in exchange for legal immunity and assistance in returning questionable pieces from their collections. One particularly wealthy tech entrepreneur had donated over $30 million to the Foundation after discovering that 6 paintings in his private museum had been looted from Jewish families during the Holocaust. Daniel found himself traveling frequently now, speaking at international conferences and consulting with government agencies around the world about art recovery efforts. His story had resonated far beyond the art world, becoming a symbol of individual integrity in an age when moral compromises seemed to be the norm rather than the exception. Universities offered him honorary degrees, documentary filmmakers followed him around with cameras, and publishers competed to acquire the rights to his memoir. But Daniel remained focused on the practical work of helping other people navigate similar discoveries. The most challenging case the Foundation had taken on involved a massive collection of Asian art that had been discovered in a warehouse outside Seattle. Apparently stolen from museums and temples across China, Japan, and Southeast Asia during various conflicts throughout the 20th century. The legal complexities were staggering, involving multiple governments, international treaties, and cultural institutions that had very different ideas about how stolen art should be handled. Daniel spent months shuttling between law offices, embassies, and museums, trying to build consensus around a repatriation plan that would satisfy all the competing claims. Sarah had become particularly interested in the stories behind individual pieces. Spending countless hours interviewing elderly survivors and their descendants to understand the personal significance of objects that might seem like mere commodities to outsiders. She had learned that a simple ceramic bowl could represent a family's entire lost history, that a small painting might be the only remaining connection between a Holocaust survivor and their murdered parents. These human stories gave weight and urgency to the Foundation's work, transforming abstract legal and ethical questions into deeply personal missions of healing and justice. The Pine Ridge bunker itself had been transformed into a high-tech research facility and museum, funded by a coalition of international art institutions and government agencies. The climate-controlled chambers that had once housed stolen masterpieces now contained sophisticated equipment for analyzing and authenticating artwork. While the upper levels had been converted into classrooms and conference rooms where experts from around the world gathered to share information and coordinate recovery efforts. The site had become a pilgrimage destination for people interested in art, history, and the ongoing effort to heal the wounds of the past. Daniel's relationship with Dr. Morrison had deepened over the years into both a professional partnership and a close personal friendship that had helped him navigate the complexities of his new role in the art world. She had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Sarah, providing guidance and support as the young woman struggled to balance her family's newfound prominence with her own desire to make a meaningful contribution to the Bater field. Dr. Morrison's academic credentials and international reputation had been crucial in legitimizing the Foundation's work and opening doors that might have remained closed to a former construction worker from a Taquares small mountain town. The legal framework surrounding art recovery had evolved significantly in response to cases like the Pine Ridge discovery, with new international agreements making it easier to return stolen cultural property across borders. Daniel had testified before congressional committees and United Nations working groups, helping to shape legislation that balanced the rights of good faith purchasers with the claims of original owners and their heirs. His testimony had been particularly influential because he spoke not as an academic or legal expert, but as someone who had faced these moral dilemmas personally and chosen the path of restitution rather than personal enrichment. The Foundation's success had created new problems as well as new opportunities, with hundreds of people contacting them every month claiming to have discovered stolen art or asking for help with questionable inheritances. Sarah had developed a systematic approach to evaluating these claims, using databases of missing artwork and expert networks to quickly identify pieces that warranted serious investigation. Many of the claims turned out to be misunderstandings or wishful thinking, but enough were legitimate to keep the Foundation's investigators busy traveling around the world following leads and building cases. One particularly memorable case had involved an elderly farmer in Nebraska who had discovered a hidden compartment in his barn, containing dozens of Native American artifacts that had been stolen from reservation museums during the 1920s and 30s. The farmer's grandfather had apparently purchased the items from a dealer who specialized in looted indigenous art, never realizing that he was participating in cultural genocide. Daniel and Sarah had worked for 2 years to identify the tribal origins of the artifacts and arrange for their return to appropriate cultural centers, often working directly with tribal elders who remembered the pieces from their childhood visits to community museums. The international scope of the Foundation's work had brought Daniel into contact with law enforcement agencies, diplomatic missions, and cultural institutions around the world, creating a network of relationships that had proven invaluable in tracking down other hidden collections. Interpol had designated the Foundation as a preferred partner for art recovery cases, providing access to classified databases and international resources that had dramatically expanded their ability to bulb bass, identify and locate stolen pieces. Daniel often joked that he had accidentally become an international art detective, but the work required skills and knowledge that he had never imagined needing when he was swinging hammers and installing drywall. Sarah's academic career had flourished alongside her work with the Foundation, with her research on wartime art trafficking earning recognition from scholars and institutions around the world. She had been invited to present her findings at conferences in London, Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo, building relationships with international experts who shared her passion for returning stolen cultural property to Bile, its rightful owners. Her dual perspective as both an academic researcher and a practical advocate had made her a uniquely valuable voice in policy discussions about art recovery and cultural restitution. The personal costs of their prominent role in the art recovery world had been significant as well, with Daniel and Sarah both struggling to maintain normal relationships and privacy in the face of constant media attention, and professional demands. Daniel had attempted to date several women over the years, but the intensity of his work and the complexity of his public profile had made it difficult to build lasting romantic relationships. Sarah had chosen to attend college under an assumed name to avoid the constant questions and assumptions about her family's wealth and prominence, though her real identity had eventually been discovered by enterprising teen journalists. The psychological impact of dealing with so many stories of loss, trauma, and historical injustice had required both father and daughter to seek counseling and support from mental health professionals who specialized in working with people exposed to secondary trauma. Daniel had learned that carrying the weight of other people's losses and hopes could be just as demanding as any physical labor he had done in his construction career, requiring different kinds of strength and resilience that he had needed to develop over time. The Foundation's headquarters had expanded from a small office in Pine Ridge to a complex of buildings that housed researchers, legal specialists, and administrative staff from around the world. The operation employed over 50 people full-time, with satellite offices in major cities across 3 continents and partnerships with universities, museums, and government agencies in more than 20,000 countries. What had started as Daniel's personal moral crisis had evolved into a sophisticated international organization that was making measurable progress in addressing one of history's most persistent forms of cultural violence. The financial success of the Foundation had also created new opportunities for Daniel to support other causes and organizations that aligned with his values and experiences. He had established scholarship programs for children of military veterans, funded housing assistance for families facing eviction, and supported educational initiatives in rural communities like Pine Ridge that often lacked resources for enrichment programs. The $8 million he had received from the original discovery had been invested wisely, generating returns that supported both his family's comfortable lifestyle and an expanding portfolio of philanthropic activities. Sarah's expertise in art history and cultural recovery had made her a sought-after consultant for museums, auction houses, and private collectors who wanted to ensure that their acquisitions were ethically sourced and legally obtained. She had developed a reputation for thorough research and honest assessments, sometimes disappointing clients by identifying pieces that needed to be returned to their original owners rather than added to collections. Her integrity and expertise had made her one of the youngest people ever elected to the board of the International Association of Art Recovery Specialists, a professional organization that had grown dramatically in influence and membership since the Pine Ridge discovery had raised public awareness of art theft issues. The bunker site had become a center for cutting-edge research in art authentication and preservation, with scientists from around the world using the facility's equipment to develop new techniques for identifying stolen pieces and verifying their provenance. The climate control systems that had preserved Viktor Petrov's hidden collection for so many decades had been studied and improved, creating new standards for art storage that were being implemented in museums and private collections worldwide. The irony that technology originally designed to hide stolen art was now being used to expose and recover similar pieces was not lost on Daniel or the researchers who worked at the facility. International media coverage of the Foundation's work had inspired similar organizations in other countries, creating a global network of art recovery advocates who shared information, resources, and strategies for addressing cultural theft and restitution. Daniel had been invited to serve on the boards of several of these organizations, helping to coordinate efforts and avoid duplication of work across different regions and specialties. The movement had grown from his individual decision to do the right thing into a worldwide effort that was making measurable progress in addressing historical injustices. The complexity of some recovery cases had required the Foundation to develop expertise in areas far beyond art history and legal advocacy, including genealogy, linguistics, forensic science, and international diplomacy. Sarah had become fluent in 3 languages beyond English and was working on a 4th, recognizing that effective communication with claimants, officials, and experts around the world required cultural sensitivity as well as technical knowledge. The Foundation's staff included specialists in everything from medieval manuscripts to contemporary photography, each bringing unique skills and perspectives to the common mission of cultural recovery and justice. Daniel's memoir had finally been completed and published to widespread critical acclaim, with proceeds from book sales supporting the Foundation's educational and outreach programs. The book had been translated into 15 languages and had inspired readers around the world to examine their own possessions and family histories for evidence of cultural theft or questionable acquisitions. Several major discoveries had been traced directly to readers who had been motivated by Daniel's story to investigate suspicious items in their own collections or inheritances. The 25th anniversary of the original discovery was marked by an international conference in Pine Ridge that brought together art recovery experts, law enforcement officials, government representatives, and family members whose heritage had been restored through the Foundation's work. The event had been both a celebration of progress made and a sobering reminder of how much work remained to be done in addressing the legacy of systematic cultural theft that had occurred throughout the 20th century. Sarah's doctoral dissertation had focused on developing new methods for using artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify patterns in art trafficking networks, potentially revolutionizing the field by making it possible to track stolen pieces across decades and continents with unprecedented accuracy. Her research had attracted attention from technology companies interested in applying these techniques to other forms of cultural preservation and recovery, creating new possibilities for addressing not just historical theft, but ongoing trafficking in cultural artifacts. The personal relationships that had grown out of the Foundation's work had become one of its most valuable and meaningful aspects, connecting Daniel and Sarah with families, communities, and individuals around the world who shared their commitment to justice and historical healing. They had attended weddings, funerals, and celebrations in dozens of countries, often serving as honored guests at events marking the return of stolen cultural property to its rightful place. These relationships had enriched their lives in ways that went far beyond professional success or financial security. The Foundation's success had also attracted criticism from some quarters, with critics arguing that the focus on returning stolen art to original owners ignored the legitimate interests of current holders who had purchased pieces in good faith. Daniel had learned to navigate these complex ethical and legal debates, acknowledging the validity of different perspectives, while maintaining his commitment to the principle that stolen property should be returned, regardless of how many hands it had passed through in the intervening years. The education and outreach programs developed by the Foundation had reached hundreds of thousands of students around the world, teaching them about the importance of cultural heritage and the ongoing impact of DASA, historical theft and violence. Sarah had been particularly passionate about developing age-appropriate curricula that helped children understand these complex issues without overwhelming them with traumatic details. Recognizing that future generations would need to carry forward the work of cultural recovery and reconciliation. As Daniel approached his 60th birthday, he often reflected on the unlikely journey that had taken him from a struggling handyman to an internationally recognized advocate for cultural justice. The transformation had required him to develop skills and knowledge he had never imagined needing, to travel to places he had never expected to visit, and to take on responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming in their scope and importance. But it had also provided him and Sarah with a sense of purpose and meaning that had enriched their lives in ways that money alone could never have achieved. The legacy of the Pine Ridge discovery continued to evolve and expand, inspiring new research, informing policy decisions, and motivating individuals around the world to examine their own role in addressing, quote, historical injustices. Daniel's choice to seek help, rather than simply take what he had found, had created ripple effects that would continue long after he was gone, proving that individual decisions could indeed change the world in profound and lasting ways. The Cold War bunker that had once hidden stolen treasures had been transformed into a beacon of hope for cultural recovery, demonstrating that even the darkest chapters of human history could be rewritten through courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The Foundation's work had attracted the attention of Hollywood producers and streaming platforms, leading to the development of a major motion picture based on Daniel's story that would bring the message of cultural recovery to an even broader audience. Sarah had been heavily involved in the screenplay development, ensuring that the film accurately portrayed both the excitement of discovery and the moral complexities of dealing with stolen cultural property. The movie's production had provided additional funding for the Foundation's work, while also raising public awareness about art theft issues in ways that academic conferences and policy papers never could. Daniel had been initially reluctant to see his family's story dramatized for entertainment, worried that the complexities and nuances of real art recovery work would be lost in the pursuit of Hollywood excitement. However, the director and screenwriters had proven surprisingly committed to authenticity, spending months interviewing survivors, experts, and law enforcement officials to ensure that the film would serve as both compelling entertainment and effective education about cultural theft and recovery. The casting process had been particularly sensitive, with the production team working closely with cultural consultants to ensure respectful representation of the various communities whose heritage had been affected by P.S. art looting. The international premiere of the film had taken place in Pine Ridge itself, with the small mountain town hosting delegations from around the world and media coverage that rivaled major film festivals. Holocaust survivors, tribal elders, museum directors, and government officials had gathered to watch Daniel's story unfold on the big screen, many of them seeing their own experiences reflected in the broader narrative of loss, discovery, and restoration. The emotional impact of seeing these real-life stories dramatized had been overwhelming for many attendees, with several survivors commenting that the film had helped them process traumatic memories that had been buried for decades. Sarah's romantic life had finally stabilized when she met David Chen, a documentary filmmaker and distant relative of Marcus Chen, who had been researching his family's history and accidentally discovered the connection to the Pine Ridge discovery. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, both of them understanding the complexities of building a personal life while working in such a demanding and emotionally charged field. David's background in journalism and filmmaking had proven invaluable to the Foundation's outreach efforts, helping them develop more effective ways of telling the stories behind recovered artworks and the families who had been reunited with their heritage. The couple's engagement had been announced at the Foundation's annual conference, with Daniel walking Sarah down an aisle lined with representatives from dozens of countries whose cultural property had been recovered through their work. The wedding ceremony itself had been a celebration of both personal love and professional mission, with guests including Holocaust survivors, Native American elders, FBI agents, museum curators, and academic researchers who would become extended family through years of shared work and commitment. The Foundation's research had led to several breakthrough discoveries that had fundamentally changed understanding of how art trafficking networks had operated during and after World War II. Sarah's analysis of shipping records, insurance documents, and customs declarations had revealed patterns that allowed investigators to predict where other caches of stolen art might be hidden, leading to discoveries in abandoned warehouses, private estates, and even bank vaults across 3 continents. These findings had been shared with law enforcement agencies and resulted in the recovery of artwork worth over $2 billion in the past 5 years alone. One of the most significant discoveries had been a network of Swiss bank accounts that had been used to finance art purchases by Nazi officials and their collaborators, with records showing systematic looting operations that had targeted specific communities and institutions based on detailed intelligence about their cultural holdings. The paper trail had led investigators to previously unknown storage facilities in Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, where fleeing war criminals had hidden looted artwork along with other assets stolen from their victims. Daniel's expertise in construction and engineering had proven unexpectedly valuable in these investigations, as his knowledge of building techniques and structural systems helped teams understand how hidden compartments and secret storage areas had been constructed in various locations. He had consulted on excavations and building searches from Budapest to Buenos Aires, using his practical skills to identify spaces where artwork might have been concealed by people who understood that their crimes would eventually be discovered and investigated. The emotional toll of this work had deepened over the years, as Daniel and Sarah encountered increasingly disturbing evidence of the systematic nature of cultural theft and the deliberate destruction of entire communities' heritage. They had learned to recognize the signs of psychological burnout in themselves and their colleagues, establishing support systems and counseling resources that had become a model for other organizations dealing with historical trauma and secondary exposure to violence and loss. The Foundation had also begun working with contemporary artists and cultural workers who were creating new pieces to replace items that had been destroyed or could never be recovered. Recognizing that cultural healing sometimes required not just returning stolen property, but also supporting the creation of new works that could carry forward interrupted traditions. These collaborative projects had brought together survivors, their descendants, and contemporary artists in creative partnerships that were producing powerful new works while also honoring the memory of what had been lost. Sarah's doctoral research had evolved into a comprehensive database that used machine learning algorithms to identify patterns in art sales, auction records, and insurance claims that might indicate the presence of stolen property in legitimate markets. The system had been adopted by major auction houses and museums around the world, creating new standards for provenance research that were making it much more difficult for stolen art to be sold openly. Her work had essentially created an early warning system that could flag suspicious transactions and alert law enforcement agencies before stolen pieces could disappear back into private collections. The success of these technological innovations had attracted investment from major tech companies interested in applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to cultural preservation and protection efforts. Sarah had been recruited by several Silicon Valley firms offering enormous salaries and equity packages, but she had chosen to remain with the Foundation while accepting consulting arrangements that provided additional funding for their work. The balance between technological innovation and human-centered advocacy had become one of her particular areas of expertise. Daniel's speaking engagements had expanded beyond art recovery conferences to include business schools, ethics programs, and leadership development seminars, where his story was used to illustrate the long-term benefits of making difficult moral choices, even when easier options were available. His message that integrity could be both personally rewarding and professionally successful had resonated particularly strongly with young professionals who were navigating their own ethical challenges in competitive RS. Industries. The Pine Ridge Research Center had become a destination for scholars from around the world, with visiting fellowship programs that brought together experts in art history, law enforcement, international relations, and conflict resolution to work on collaborative projects addressing cultural theft and recovery. The interdisciplinary approach had generated new insights and methodologies that were being applied to other forms of cultural violence and historical injustice, from the looting of archaeological sites to the suppression of indigenous languages and traditions. The center's digital archives had grown to include over 50,000 images, documents, and records related to art theft and recovery cases from around the world, creating an unprecedented resource for researchers, law enforcement agencies, and families searching for lost heritage. The database was accessible to qualified researchers through secure connections, with privacy protections for sensitive information, while still allowing for the kind of comprehensive analysis that had made Sarah's breakthrough discoveries possible. The Foundation's educational programs had expanded to include virtual reality experiences that allowed students to walk through recreated crime scenes, examine evidence, and understand the investigative process that led to successful recoveries. These immersive learning tools had been particularly effective in helping young people understand the human impact of cultural theft, moving beyond abstract discussions of legal and ethical issues to create emotional connections with the victims and survivors whose lives had been affected by these crimes. Daniel's relationship with law enforcement had evolved from simple cooperation to genuine partnership, with the FBI, Interpol, and other agencies regularly consulting him on complex cases that required both investigative expertise and cultural sensitivity. His ability to communicate with families and communities who had lost cultural property had proven invaluable in building trust and cooperation that was essential for successful recovery efforts. Many agents had commented that Daniel's background as a working-class father had given him credibility and relatability that traditional law enforcement officers sometimes struggled to achieve. The financial management of the Foundation's growing resources had required Daniel to develop skills in investment strategy, grant writing, and nonprofit administration that he had never imagined needing during his construction career. He had assembled a board of directors that included experts in finance, law, international relations, and cultural preservation, ensuring that the organization's mission would continue even after his eventual retirement from active leadership. The international legal framework surrounding art recovery had continued to evolve in response to cases and precedents established through the Foundation's work, with new treaties and agreements making it easier to pursue cross-border investigations and return stolen cultural property to its rightful owners. Daniel had testified before parliamentary committees in several countries, helping to shape legislation that balanced the interests of various stakeholders while prioritizing the rights of original owners and their separate communities. The success of the Pine Ridge discovery had inspired the creation of similar research and recovery centers in other locations where significant art theft had occurred, including facilities in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America that were addressing region-specific issues and cultural contexts. These partner organizations shared resources and expertise with the Pine Ridge Center, creating a global network that was more effective than any single institution could have been working alone. Sarah's wedding to David had been featured in several international publications, not because of celebrity or social status, but because their partnership represented the continuation and expansion of the work that had grown out of Daniel's original discovery. Their honeymoon had been spent visiting recovery sites and meeting with colleagues around the world, combining personal celebration with professional mission in ways that reflected their shared commitment to the Foundation's work. The couple's first child, a daughter they named Hope, in honor of the optimism that had sustained the Foundation's work through difficult and sometimes discouraging investigations, had become something of a mascot for the organization's family-friendly workplace culture. Daniel's role as grandfather had brought new dimensions to his understanding of legacy and inheritance, making him even more committed to ensuring that future generations would inherit a world where cultural theft was rare and recovery was swift and comprehensive. The Foundation's work had begun to influence urban planning and historic preservation efforts in communities around the world, with planners and preservationists recognizing that protecting cultural heritage required not just maintaining buildings and sites, but also ensuring that the artifacts and artworks that gave them meaning remained in their proper cultural context. This holistic approach to cultural preservation had become a model for community development projects that prioritized cultural continuity alongside economic growth. Daniel's memoir had been adapted into a documentary series that explored not just his personal story, but also the broader historical and contemporary context of art, theft, and recovery efforts around AI. The World. Each episode had focused on a different case or community, showing how the principles and methods developed through the Pine Ridge discovery were being applied to address cultural theft in various contexts and regions. The series had won several international awards and had been translated into dozens of languages, reaching audiences that had never been exposed to these issues before and inspiring new volunteers, donors, and advocates to join the growing movement for cultural recovery and justice. The global reach of modern media had amplified the Foundation's impact in ways that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional academic and policy channels alone. As Daniel entered his 70s, he had begun the process of gradually transferring leadership responsibilities to Sarah and the next generation of recovery specialists who had been trained through the Foundation's fellowship and internship programs. The transition had been carefully planned to ensure continuity of mission and effectiveness, while also allowing for innovation and adaptation to changing technologies and international conditions. The Pine Ridge discovery had become a case study taught in schools around the world, not just in art history and law programs, but also in ethics courses, business schools, and leadership development programs, where Daniel's story was used to illustrate the power of individual integrity to create positive change. The educational impact of his choice had reached millions of students who would carry forward the lessons they had learned about moral courage and the importance of doing the right thing, even when it required personal sacrifice. The bunker itself had been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing its unique role in both concealing and ultimately revealing stolen cultural treasures, while also serving as a symbol of the ongoing effort to address historical injustices through individual conscience and international cooperation. The designation had brought additional resources and protection to the site, while also increasing its visibility as a destination for cultural tourism and educational programming. Looking back on the decades that had passed since he first opened that rusted steel door, Daniel often marveled at the impossible complexity and richness of the life that had grown from a single moment of moral clarity. The scared, desperate father, who had wondered whether to sell stolen art to pay his bills, had been transformed into an internationally respected advocate whose work had touched the lives of thousands of families and communities around the world, proving that ordinary people facing impossible choices could indeed change the world through courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The Foundation's influence had begun to extend beyond art recovery into broader areas of social justice and historical reconciliation, with their methodologies being adapted to address other forms of systematic theft and cultural violence. Indigenous communities in Australia, New Zealand, and North America had adopted the Foundation's approach to document and, quote, recover sacred objects that had been taken from their territories by collectors and museums during periods of colonial expansion. The success of these initiatives had led to new international protocols for handling indigenous cultural property and sacred items. Daniel's granddaughter Hope had grown into a precocious 5-year-old who often accompanied her grandfather to the research center. Her childlike questions about the artwork and artifacts, sometimes leading to breakthrough insights that had eluded adult experts. Her innocent curiosity about why people would steal beautiful things had inspired the development of new educational materials specifically designed for young children, helping them understand concepts of ownership, cultural heritage, and justice in age-appropriate ways. Hope's presence at the center had also reminded the staff of the importance of maintaining hope and optimism even when dealing with the darkest aspects of human behavior. The psychological support programs developed by the Foundation had evolved into a comprehensive system that was being used by other organizations dealing with historical trauma and secondary exposure to violence. Mental health professionals from around the world had come to study the Foundation's approach to preventing burnout and supporting workers who were constantly exposed to stories of loss, theft, and cultural destruction. The program had become a model for sustainable advocacy work that recognized the human costs of fighting injustice while providing practical tools for maintaining emotional health and professional effectiveness. Sarah's research into artificial intelligence applications for cultural preservation had attracted attention from major technology companies who were developing new tools for protecting cultural sites and artifacts from theft, vandalism, and environmental damage. Her work had contributed to satellite monitoring systems that could detect unauthorized excavations at archaeological sites, facial recognition software that could identify stolen artifacts in online sales platforms, and predictive algorithms that could anticipate where cultural theft might occur based on political instability, natural disasters, and economic conditions. The partnership between the Foundation and various law enforcement agencies had resulted in the creation of specialized training programs for police, customs officials, and border guards who might encounter stolen cultural property in the course of their regular duties. These programs had significantly increased the number of recovered items and successful prosecutions, while also raising awareness among frontline law enforcement officers about the importance of cultural property protection. The training materials had been translated into over 30 languages and were being used by agencies on every continent. Daniel's influence on international policy had extended to post-conflict reconstruction efforts, where his expertise in cultural recovery was being applied to help communities rebuild their cultural institutions and recover looted heritage in the aftermath of wars and civil conflicts. He had consulted on recovery efforts in Syria, Iraq, Mali, and other countries where systematic looting of cultural sites had been used as a weapon of war and cultural destruction. These projects had required him to work closely with international peacekeeping forces, humanitarian organizations, and local community leaders to develop culturally sensitive approaches to heritage recovery. The economic impact of the Foundation's work had become increasingly apparent as recovered artworks were returned to their home communities and countries, often generating significant tourism revenue and cultural pride that contributed to economic development and social cohesion. Several small towns and rural communities had experienced economic revitalization after major artworks were returned to local museums and cultural centers, attracting visitors and investment that created jobs and opportunities for local residents. The Foundation's publishing program had produced a series of academic books and popular publications that had become standard references in multiple fields, from art history and museum studies to international law and conflict resolution. Sarah's doctoral dissertation had been expanded into a comprehensive textbook on technology-assisted art recovery that was being used in graduate programs around the world, while Daniel's memoir continued to inspire new generations of advocates and professionals working in cultural preservation and recovery. The annual Pine Ridge International Conference on Cultural Recovery had grown into one of the most important gatherings in the field, attracting hundreds of participants from academia, law enforcement, government agencies, and affected communities. The conference had become a forum for sharing new research, coordinating international efforts, and building the personal relationships that were essential for effective cross-border cooperation and recovery efforts. The networking and collaboration that occurred at these meetings had led to numerous joint investigations and successful recoveries that might never have happened without these face-to-face connections. Daniel's health had remained remarkably good despite the demanding travel schedule and emotional intensity of his work. Though he had begun to scale back his international commitments to spend more time with Hope and focus on training the next generation of recovery specialists. His decision to step back from active fieldwork had been difficult but necessary, as the physical demands of investigating storage sites and meeting with families around the world had become increasingly challenging as he entered his mid-70s. The succession planning process had revealed the depth and breadth of expertise that had been developed within the Foundation over the years. With dozens of staff members and associates who were capable of carrying forward different aspects of the organization's mission. Sarah's leadership had been formally recognized through her appointment as executive director, while Daniel transitioned to the role of founder emeritus with continued involvement in strategic planning and major case consultations. The Foundation's endowment had grown to over $200 million through careful investment management and continued donations from grateful families, institutions, and governments whose cultural heritage had been recovered through their work. This financial stability had allowed the organization to take on increasingly complex and long-term projects without worrying about short-term funding pressures, while also providing resources for emergency response to cultural theft incidents around the world. The collaboration with entertainment industry partners had expanded beyond the original Hollywood film to include television series, video games, and interactive media that were reaching new audiences and inspiring interest in cultural recovery, work among young people who might never have encountered these issues through traditional educational channels. The gamification of art recovery investigations had proven particularly effective in teaching complex problem-solving skills while also raising awareness about historical and contemporary cultural theft. Hope's presence in Daniel's life had brought new perspective to his understanding of legacy and inheritance, making him more conscious of the world he would leave for future generations and more committed to ensuring that the systems and institutions he had helped create would continue to function effectively long after his personal involvement ended. Her innocent questions about fairness, ownership, and justice had often cut through complex legal and ethical arguments to identify the core moral issues at stake in recovery cases. The Foundation's work had begun to influence academic curricula in fields ranging from elementary education to graduate professional programs, with courses on cultural recovery and heritage protection now being offered at universities around the world. The interdisciplinary nature of this work had created new academic specializations and career paths for students who were passionate about combining historical research, legal advocacy, technological innovation, and social justice in their professional lives. Daniel's relationship with the original families whose artwork had been recovered from the Pine Ridge bunker had deepened over the years into lasting friendships that had enriched his understanding of cultural identity and historical memory. He had attended countless family celebrations, memorial services, and cultural events where recovered artworks played central roles in maintaining connections between past and present, ancestors and descendants, lost worlds and contemporary communities. The therapeutic impact of art recovery on survivors and their families had become an important area of research and practice, with mental health professionals studying how the return of stolen cultural property could contribute to healing from historical trauma and building resilience in communities that had experienced systematic persecution, and loss. This research had informed the development of culturally sensitive approaches to trauma therapy that were being used in various contexts around the world. The technological innovations developed through Sarah's research had begun to be applied to other forms of cultural preservation and protection, including efforts to document and preserve endangered languages, traditional crafts, and cultural practices that were at risk of disappearing due to globalization, urbanization, and generational change. The same machine learning algorithms that could identify stolen artworks were being adapted to analyze and preserve oral traditions, folk music, and other intangible forms of cultural heritage. As Daniel prepared for his eventual full retirement from active involvement in the Foundation's work, he had begun writing a second book that would focus on the broader lessons learned from decades of cultural recovery work and their applications to other forms of social justice and historical reconciliation. This new work would synthesize his experiences with contemporary research in psychology, sociology, and political science to provide a comprehensive framework for understanding how individual moral choices could create lasting institutional and social change. The Pine Ridge discovery had become more than just a remarkable story of hidden treasure and moral courage. It had evolved into a symbol of hope for addressing some of humanity's most persistent problems through individual integrity, international cooperation, and unwavering commitment to justice. The legacy that Daniel and Sarah had built together would continue to grow and evolve long after their direct involvement ended, carried forward by the thousands of people whose lives had been touched by their work and inspired by their example to make their own contributions to healing the wounds of history and building a more just and compassionate world.